this course we've seen how violence is like a seed that grows and spreads, and violence can escalate in our world. But we've also seen how God intervenes, how God's heart is to end this spiral of violence, and how in the teaching of Jesus we're told not to violently resist the evildoer. We've looked a little bit at how that applies. What we're going to do in this session is take us back into the Old Testament. We're going to look at a variety of things tracking through the Old Testament that speak into the conversation. We'll pick up conversations around the death penalty. We'll look at a few other commands in the law. We'll see what military defence looked like in Israel, and then we'll pick up some of the Psalms where people were praying for violence, and then the story of Esther and some words from the prophets as well. But let's start with the idea of the death penalty. Now, we ended last time by talking about non-violence being kind of based on the idea that God is just, that judgment belongs to the Lord and is in his hands. Now, sometimes in the story we see that this judgment from God is delegated to human agents. We mentioned earlier Genesis 9. This is an example of that. So as people have come off the ark, as God's speaking to them, and there's this fresh start, there's the institution of a death penalty. It says this is Genesis 9, 5 and 6. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I'll demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I'll demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So these verses seem to say pretty clearly, when a human takes a life, their life is to be taken in return. Which I think forces us to ask the question, okay, well, does this mean that we should have the death penalty today? Because this is probably the key part of Scripture that those who would argue for it will base their arguments. One of the tools for hermeneutics that we sometimes teach is the interpretive journey. When we're looking to understand a passage, we ask a few different questions. We want to grasp the text in the world of our original audience. Now, what did it mean to them? We want to look at the differences between their culture and ours. Like, how is our world different, and what difference might that make? Yeah. Then we think about crossing that bridge. So what is the principle that's in our passage that then might apply? We'll take that through the New Testament. Does anything in the New Testament modify what we have seen? And then we think about how we apply it in our world. Let's try that on this Genesis 9 passage. What's it saying to them in their world? Well, it said if someone kills a human, then God demands an accounting. It's establishing a proportionate justice, and it's delegating that to humans. So that's kind of a summary of what it's saying to them. But what's the difference between their world and our world? One key one is we live in a day where a prison system exists. We have ways of applying the principles, deterrence, protection and rehabilitation in ways that perhaps more closely align with how God tricked Cain, putting the mark on him, and some of the things we've seen in the New Testament in the teaching of Jesus. So Helen Painter argues this. While arguably no civilised modern society should have the death penalty, it's hard to imagine an ancient society functioning without one. And we need to take care to avoid trying to apply modern sensibilities to the ancient world. In the UK, where I'm writing, we have modern, reasonably comfortable, generally well-regulated prisons. No such options were available to the primarily nomadic peoples to whom the Mosaic law was first given. So imagine their world. Imagine there is no prison system at all, and you have a violent murderer in the midst of society. How do you protect society? You can see why this was mandated in their terms, but we do live in different times. So we ask here, well, what's the theological principle at stake here? Where's this? That human life is precious and taking it should be costly. Does the New Testament say anything that modifies or qualifies the principle? Well, it says plenty, doesn't it? The teaching that we've seen from Jesus about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. The example shown with Jesus when there was the woman brought to him who'd been caught in adultery. He was able to throw a stone at her and apply a death penalty. He chooses not to. He chooses a different approach. Even the logic of the gospel itself, like pardon for those who deserve death. There's plenty in the New Testament that speaks to the question. So rather than kind of lifting from Genesis 9 without thought for context and principle and just dumping it in our world, well, how would we apply the principle that we've seen in a world like ours? Maybe not through the direct application of a death penalty, but rather through understanding the costliness of human life, ensuring there are appropriate sanctions and deterrents, and fighting against the cycle of violence. Let's look at some of the other laws in the Old Testament. You've got a few laws that seem to caveat or modify this teaching on the death penalty. Exodus 21 verses 12 to 14 bring the situation where someone's killed someone, but they didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. It said, okay, well, in that case, they're not to be put to death. Numbers 35 says, okay, you're going to need witnesses. You're going to need multiple witnesses in order to do it. They're just kind of say this isn't a like one-size-fits-all thing to do. Let's start nuancing depending on the situation. So one of the classic examples in the law, of course, is in the Ten Commandments. You shall not murder. That's a direct command against violence, isn't it? And we've seen that Jesus takes this and applies it more widely, not just murder in mind, but also the way we speak to each other, the anger that we have that comes from that heart. That's all within this commandment, according to Jesus. I mean, one of the laws that I think is really helpful to think about, though, is found in Exodus 22, describing the situation of a home break-in. So it says this: if a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Now, clearly this law is picturing a situation where someone breaks into a home and there is some kind of struggle and some kind of resistance. This links to what we were talking about in the previous session about like physical restraint. But what it is saying is there should not be an escalation from that restraint into lethal force. And the distinction of it happening at night versus in the day seems to be one of intent. Well, obviously there's no artificial lighting available in those days. So if someone breaks in at night, then you're trying to resist them in the dark. And it's quite likely that the fatal blow would be accidental. You don't see what you're doing. But in the daytime, it's much less likely to be an accident. So it's talking about the difference between kind of the legitimate physical struggle and restraint versus the violence of trying to go for the harm to the person who's done it. Within the laws as well, there are commands against retaliation. It says in Leviticus 19, don't hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbour frankly so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. So along with the laws regulating specific actions, there's a shaping of the heart, isn't there? Not to bear a grudge, not to hate, but to love those around us. So Jesus can take all these commands of the law and say this: in everything, do to others what you'd have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. He sees the sum total of all of these commands as do to others what you would have them do for you. Let's move on a little bit and let's talk about the area of war. Let's talk about what military defence looked like for Israel. Now, we definitely see Israel engaged in wars, and they're quite remarkable. So God fought for his people in ways that are very direct and observable. So think about when the Exodus story happened, and God opened the seas for them, and they closed the seas on the pursuing army. Or think about the Battle of Jericho, where the people, they marched round the wall each day for a week, and then on the seventh day they walked around it 7 times. That's not conventional military strategy. They blew some trumpets and the walls fell. These are direct acts of God, and they're very different to soldiers going out to fight against soldiers. In fact, Psalm 44, it says this: "It was not by their sword that they won the land, nor did their arm bring them victory. It was your right hand, your arm, and the light of your face, for you love them." God expected the people of Israel to trust him to fight for them. In Deuteronomy 20, he says, "When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, don't be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you." He's picturing a scene where the enemy is larger and more advanced technologically, and his instruction is not to fight fire with fire, but to trust that God is with you, that God's got this. Given the instructions for a king in Deuteronomy 17, he says the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt for more of them. For the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. Now, horses meant military technology in those days. If you wanted to fight a battle, you had chariots and cavalry, and acquiring a lot of horses would be the way to fight. But God says, don't do that. Don't build up your might of horses. It'd be like in a Western context today, saying, all right, you can have an army, you just can't have any tanks or planes, like figure it out. You know, well, it's not much of an army then, like how are we supposed to fight? But that's the point. Psalm 20 says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And this God seems to make a point of choosing the small, the weak, and the unstrategic in order to make his point clear. He's the one who does the fighting, and he's the one who gets the glory. They're not to have a standing army. They're to dismiss those people who've got new homes, who are recently engaged, who've planted vineyards, or also those who are scared, who are not up for the battle. That's quite a flex, to take the army and dismiss most of them. Think about the story of Gideon, when the army turns up and God looks at these thousands of people and says, there's too many. Like, they might think it's their own strength that's done it. And he whittles it down and down and down to just 300 people. Think about the story of David and Goliath. Goliath's got his sword, he's got his armour on. David turns up with just a little sling and a stone, but faith that God has this. Now, talking about this, one of the dangers, I think, of saying, well, God fought for them, is that's the kind of rhetoric that we've heard in many wars through history. Anyone can say that God is on their side, and armies frequently do. That's what was said by the Western powers in Iraq and the Gulf. That's what was said by Hitler. But it's one thing to say God is on our side, but it gives lie to that rhetoric where it's like, well, God's on our side, but we're going to rack up as many tanks as we can and organise for strength, just in case. No, if God's on your side, then prove it. You don't need the tanks, you don't need the army. Trust in God, if that's what you're going to do. By 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people wanted a king like all the nations. They say, we want a king over us. Then we'll be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. So they want to be led in the military way like everyone else. They want an army like all the countries around them. They don't want God to fight. So they want to kind of embrace the way of violence. And in it, there's a rejection of God and his alternate way. Now, we talked a little bit about warfare. You might be noticing, hang on, you've not said anything yet about the conquest of Canaan. That's going to come in the next session. We'll do a whole session on that. So just bear with us and skip to that when you're ready. But just to finish up this survey through the Old Testament, I'm just going to take us into the Psalms. And there's a few Psalms that are called the imprecatory Psalms. And these are Psalms where the psalmist is praying a curse upon their enemy. So one example is in Psalm 58, where the psalmist writes, "Break the teeth in their mouths, O God. Lord, tear out the fangs of those lions." Another example is Psalm 137. It says, "Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you've done to us. And happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." They're pretty hard words to hear and to read. How do we reflect on words like this being in our scripture? It's important, I think, to remember there's a distinction between expressing a desire to God and acting on it. These words are definitely coming from a heart of violence. So there's a violent sentiment being carried. But that violence is being channeled towards God in prayer rather than into acts of violence. And that's a good thing. They've left it in God's hands. Yet prayers like this still, in light of the New Testament, probably rightly trouble us. It's very different, isn't it, to what Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you. I don't think he had those kind of prayers in mind. And think about the prayer Jesus prayed on the cross, forgive them, and modelled in Stephen as well, prayed a very similar prayer as he was being put to death. So Timothy Keller reflects that the psalmist is right to want judgment on evil, but Jesus takes it himself. And this forever changes our view of our own deserts and the way we seek justice. One of the kind of classic moments of violence in the Old Testament is the story of Esther. It's where the people were given permission to use violence in self-defense. There'd been a plot to kill the Jewish people. And although the king can't revoke his command, he does allow Mordecai to draft a new command that allows the Jewish people to protect themselves and avenge themselves on those who are seeking to harm them, and also gives them permission to plunder the property of their enemies. So then that brings us to the story of Esther. And the story of Esther contains one of those moments that when you're reading through the Old Testament, you do see what seems like a mandate for violence being used in self-defense. There'd been a plot to kill the Jewish people. And though the king can't revoke his command, he does allow Mordecai to draft a new command that allows the Jewish people to protect themselves when they're attacked and to avenge themselves on those seeking to harm them. And what we have is a narrative version, a story version of the eye for an eye principle. You're trying to attack us, right? Well, we will do the same to you. On its own terms, it does seem to give somewhat of a mandate for defensive violence. But we should remember this isn't God's final word on the subject. And neither Jesus nor the disciples drew on this as an example for how they or we should respond to persecution. And looking at the light of some of what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount led them, and I would argue should lead us, to make very different choices when we face suffering and persecution ourselves. Finally, in the Old Testament, let's turn to the prophets. As the prophets cast a vision of hope for the future, it's of a time when there will be no more war, when swords are beaten into ploughshares, when war and militarism are condemned, and bloodshed seen as something that creates a barrier between ourselves and God. And the promise that the prophets make of Jesus is the Prince of Peace, the one who will bring peace to us, the one who never done any violence, but by the punishment that was on him, brought peace for us all.